What's up, everyone? Welcome back to another Lessons from the Table. I was going to have this one up sooner, but I was ill, and then I ended up having a surprise business trip to Bangkok, so I didn't actually have time in between that to record. I kind of had to save my voice for the trip, didn't want to strain my throat or anything. Now I'm back, I'm all better, I'm good to go, and I'm going to be putting up this video, which is kind of obvious, I guess, for you because you're watching it, but this video is going to be about a concept that I think a lot of DMs naturally learn over time regardless. I feel very sorry for ones who maybe don't. And that's the concept of the game's mechanics being only a framework. And that seems really obvious when you think about it, right? You don't have to go too far to realize how we move beyond the mechanics of the game as it is, right? When you're running a game, you're already familiar with the concept of a DC being determined by a certain number or a certain formula. A spell save DC for a player is determined by 8 plus your proficiency bonus plus the ability modifier, right? So then when you're having to set a DC or difficulty challenge for something completely different, be it jumping over a pit, disarming a trap, convincing someone to do something for you, you're coming up with a DC kind of freely. You don't have a formula to plug in, but you know what a DC is, and you know how it's calculated for a player, and you kind of know how difficult a thing is to do, so you kind of fill in the gaps yourself. The DM's Guide does discuss this a little bit, that, come up with a number that feels right for what it is they're trying to do. It also gives them in discrete batches of 5, but it doesn't mean we have to set them at a 5. We learn very quickly that we can go beyond the written mechanics of the game. We can just use this idea of DCs and these hard intervals of difficulty as a framework to say, okay, this isn't quite a 15 difficulty, this isn't quite a 20 difficulty, this is going to be a 17. You've got to beat a 17 here. We already know to do this, but it's funny, a lot of DMs don't apply that to other parts of the game, at least not until quite a bit later. Now, I think this is fair enough. I think every DM should become comfortable with the mechanics as they exist before moving beyond them itself, but there are a lot of, I don't quite want to say complaints, but I maybe say gripes that some DMs have, or maybe things in the game that leave us a little unsatisfied, or indeed mechanics in the game that are perfectly serviceable yet can still be expanded upon, and this is something I want to discuss in this video. Mechanics as being only a framework. You can play the game perfectly rules as written, and you're going to have an absolutely fine game of D&D. That's great. If you can do that flawlessly, you're still running a great campaign. This is not necessary stuff, but it is a good way for you to enhance your game in other ways, maybe expand on areas your players like. And I'm going to bring up a particular example of something I do to that end. So the first thing I want to touch on, this is something that a lot of DMs, I think, are bothered by, those who play a little bit more and are maybe even familiar with older editions or other RPGs, is the exploration mechanics of 5th edition. Some people feel they're a bit lackluster. I don't think that that's entirely wrong either. I think there are ways they can be expanded upon. It feels very vague. But that's the thing, you can expand upon them. You are completely at liberty to come up with systems that work. There are people out there every single day coming up with systems that work and posting them online, places like the Unearthed Arcana subreddit. There are so many places you can find great homebrew. And if you feel that the exploration in your game is lacking, if your players are coming to you going, yeah, I feel like the exploration doesn't do much here, it is meant to be one of the 3 pillars of the game experience, you can go and find resources that help you with that, or you can come up with ones of your own. That's the great thing about D&D, especially 5th edition. It is very robust in the base sense, and it's very easy to expand upon. The spaces and the quote-unquote gaps in the game are actually places for you, the DM and designer of your campaign, to build what you need for your game and your campaign. If you're running a game with a lot more intrigue, you may actually want to expand on some of the social mechanics that exist in 5th edition. You can get by by just having, this very loose conversational style with your players where very few dice are being rolled, except in, the few instances one needs to make a deception check and things like that. Or you could actually expand on it wholeheartedly. You could have it be that there are a number of factions and certain very measurable activities will increase your score with said factions. Maybe once you reach a certain score, the party receives certain benefits. Maybe they get bonuses to persuasion rolls against anyone else in that faction. It makes it easier to talk to people in that faction and get them to do something for the party, work to the party's needs. Perhaps in among that system, if there are meant to be rival factions, then you could have, every point gained with faction A is also 1 point lost with faction B, and you could build a whole set of mechanics. Like, I'm just describing a very loose idea. You could put that down in hard rules and have something that's a bit more concrete and measurable for a political intrigue section of a campaign, or indeed entire campaign, if that's something you feel your players are going to need in order to get the most out of that. Not every player is able to just sit down at the table and chat with various NPCs until they figure out what's going on. Honestly, sometimes you do need to gamify that a little bit, and to do that, you want to expand on the mechanics itself. The reason those mechanics aren't in there as written is for exactly what I just said. There are some people who can just sit down, converse with various people, be, a Hercule Poirot, and talk to all the suspects and examine all the details and figure out what's going on without having to have these concrete points of progression. Okay, because of this person, I can tick that box if they are not a suspect, right? You're kind of going off a bit of a feeling, a bit of an intuition, trying to discern truth from lie. And some players are able to do that. That's why there isn't a mechanic written into the game as it is that says, this is how to run factions. This is how to run a murder mystery. If you are going to run something like that and you need those mechanics, you are at liberty to come up with them yourself, expanding upon what the game already has. Now, I will concede the game does include a number of variant rules, and this is one of those sorts of situations where you could argue, well, why don't they just have a variant rule? DMs can implement it or not as you please. Well, because that's trying to be one size fits all, and every single table is slightly different. Maybe your table doesn't really need to have the whole, if you gain favor with one faction, you lose it with another. And maybe that's because you are running a campaign for 10-year-olds who don't have the concept of the subtleties of interfaction rivalries. It's a more simplistic good versus evil situation, but you still want to have something that helps keep score for these players. You don't want to have all those complexities, and that's why, again, this stuff isn't written into the rule set already as a variant rule, because it's the sort of thing that you will need to tailor to your group and your table and your game, and that's perfectly fine. In fact, that's a good thing. That's a helpful thing, because you know your game better than Wizards of the Coast do. Let's get real. You know your players, you know how they play, you know what they like to do. If that rule set already existed, most DMs would actually just spend a lot of time finagling the rules that exist to fit their game itself, and then you're not building upon the rules, you're altering them. That doesn't feel good. That feels like I'm going under the hood, and I don't know what else this is going to mess up. If you're just building upon it, then you know what's already there. You've got a good bedrock of good rules, and you are expanding out from there. And if things don't work, you can drop them, you can change them. Players tend to be quite understanding. If you had rules that exist and you try and muck about them, that's when you do also run the risk of your players going, this works perfectly fine, rules as written, why do you need to change things up, can we just do that? In which case, by the way, if that does ever happen to you, listen to your players. Like, go ahead and run it as written. You don't have to change the rules. So, that's what I mean when I say mechanics are a framework. Now, here's an example that I would like to bring up. This is what I use in my game. I deploy this from time to time. I have what I call an alarm system in-game. This is for when the players are moving through hostile territory. And this is one of the ways I make travel a bit more interesting and a bit more interactive. I will have a number of encounters scaled in difficulty. If this is an area they're going to be in for a long time, I will increase the number of potential encounters at any alarm level. There are 5 total levels of alarm. Sometimes I do 7. You can do 7. And the way it works is you start off with the alarm level set at 0. When the alarm level is set at 0, I've missed out a crucial detail here. This is going to be better to put here rather than later on. That's what I was going to do. So, as the players are traveling, I will say twice per day, I will roll on the alarm table. They just get that information up front. Now, when I say roll on the alarm table, I roll 3d4 if I'm doing 5 encounters. If I'm doing 7 encounters, I will roll 3d6. So let's just use 5 for this. It's the easier way to look at it. 3d4. I roll that, and then I take the number that comes up, see if it corresponds with any encounters. If it does, boom, they get an encounter. If it does not, no encounter. The reason I use 3d4, it creates what's called a bell curve, which means you are very unlikely to get a 3, you're very unlikely to get a 12, and in the middle there, it gets increasingly likely, and then it gets increasingly unlikely again. And the reason that's useful is the alarm level will start such that the most basic encounter, the easiest encounter, will be just a little bit beyond, just a little bit above the most frequent roll. So it'll be a little bit less than the most frequent number that can come up when you roll 3d4. The most dangerous encounter won't even be possible yet. But as the alarm level raises, so that's alarm level 0, let's say we go to alarm level 1, all those numbers shift 1 over to the right. So now, let's say the middlemost encounter danger-wise is on your roll of 12. It is the least likely roll, but it is possible. Your 2 more dangerous encounters beyond that are still not possible. And then your lowest level encounter is starting to hit that point of the average roll, the most likely roll when you roll 3d4. And there are certain activities that the party can do that will raise the alarm system, certain things they can do that will lower the alarm system. And what it means is they are very consciously traveling. Should we go into the river and avoid leaving tracks behind? That may raise the alarm system. And the way I tend to deploy this is in very time-sensitive situations where they've really got to make decisions, right? They've got to go, can we afford to go off the trail and move slowly here? Or do we just need to press on, knowing full well it is going to increase the enemy's awareness of our presence, and in mechanical terms, increase the alarm level, making those more dangerous encounters more possible. And the reason this is great to deploy is the more encounters they have, the more their resources get worn down, obviously. The more dangerous the encounter is, the more resources they're using again. Only a little bit more, but more. Often it's things like hit die at that point. They're going to be taking more damage. They're maybe going to be going down. If they're high level, that's diamonds they're spending on Revivify. That's things they're not going to have when they arrive at their destination to do whatever it is they need to do there. And this I found is a really great way at my table to add a layer of mechanical depth that wasn't there, to facilitate a level of strategic play that wasn't possible without it. With that in place, suddenly my players are going, okay, we know we need to get there. We know it's about 3 days travel most likely. But we need to be careful in how we do this. However, we also need to make haste. We need to get there quickly enough. And I'll include things like mobs that are obviously scout patrols. If enemies get away, and they will try and get away, that raises the alarm level, which means the party inherently changes how they have to fight. The moment they come across what is obviously a scouting party, they have to lock them down. If they turn to flee, they have to go all in on stopping whatever's trying to flee. They have to make sure everything dies. And I make it difficult for them to do that. And again, that also means I get to have an encounter with a different kind of goal, right? Now, I know that it's similar to just kill all of them before they kill all of you, but killing all of them before they run away is actually quite a different combat. So again, this extra mechanic I'm adding, or this extra set of mechanics I'm adding, is allowing for a different kind of play. It's allowing different sorts of encounters, different kinds of combats with different goals, and it all just fits in extremely naturally from there. And here's the thing as well. It creates something of a fail state. Let's say the party is 2 days into this 3-day push. They know their resources are just a bit too low to really take on whatever's at the other end. And they have to really start weighing up. Do we turn tail and head home? Do we take our time so that we don't raise the alarm, but head home nonetheless? It'll take us 3 days instead of 2, and, well, then we've lost 5 days total, but we all live. That's a decision that the party may have to be faced with if the alarm level gets too high, too fast. Now, I don't let them know exactly where the alarm level is, but I give them a decent idea. If there is increased patrols, they should notice. It should be very obvious when something raises the alarm level for them. It'll be something like a scout getting away. They will know that the alarm level has gone up. It'll be something like spotting a scouting party checking some old tracks belonging to the party. Or not packing down an old campsite before moving on, if that's something that the party is going to do. And they should also know when things are going to avoid triggering the alarms, or rather raising the alarm table. Yeah, the alarm counter, that's the term I'm looking for there. So that kind of goes back to, going through the river to not leave any tracks rather than walking over land. They should know that that allows them an amount of safety. There should always be trade-offs with that. It should be decisions that the party has to make. And here's the thing, is you could change this depending on where you are. If this is in an urban environment, it could be something like guard patrols. You could do a really detailed map with guard patrols mapped out. The party can learn over time what those patrols are. It makes it easier for them to move around without raising the alarm system, without being spotted, without being heard. But initially, maybe they don't. So maybe initially they actually go, we have to spend an extra day just learning the guard patterns before we start moving out, before we start doing, whatever criminal things they're doing in the night. Maybe you're doing this in the middle of a swamp. I actually had exactly this one very recently. It was not easy for them to find places to rest, and the places that were good for camping were the exact same places their enemy was using to camp on their patrols, which meant the party would have to first ambush a patrol on dry high ground, dispose of the bodies, and then rest before the next patrol arrived. And they didn't necessarily know how long that was, which meant they often had to take a bit of extra time watching the patrols first to learn the intervals between them. And then they had to start interacting with exhaustion mechanics in places where they couldn't rest. And suddenly these very basic mechanics that already exist in the game, things like combat, designing encounters, exhaustion levels, long rests, you tie them all together with this one extra mechanic, and they're all enhanced and accentuated. And every single player is suddenly making brand new decisions. It is also, for what it's worth, a really great way to properly use rests, actually have the 6 to 8 encounters per day. And it doesn't feel like you're just throwing encounters at parties for the heck of it. I think one of the struggles with the 6 to 8 encounters per day that a lot of DMs have is they go, well, this is going to be a really slow game. Even though not every encounter has to be combat, we're gonna spend most of this session going through one adventuring day and maybe not even arrive at our destination, which isn't particularly fun. But at least with this, there is a real concrete change. There is a reason that every single fight is happening, and it's not just because there were ogres on the road. It's because the party has somewhere to be. They are moving through enemy territory, and they need to avoid encounters. And if they do come across them, they need to dispatch of them quickly. There are discrete goals within every single combat, and the result of that combat inherently affects everything that's about to come in the next couple of adventuring days, regardless as to whether or not they're rested by the next one. So that's a specific one that I use. I know that went into a lot of depth there, but my point is, when we come back to this idea of mechanics being just a framework, you can expand on the game. We already see this in people homebrewing entire classes. That's expanding on the mechanics of the game as it is, in a pretty significant and obvious way, but that's of course not the only mechanic to expand on. Maybe you want to add firearms into your game. Maybe the DMG rules don't really fit, or maybe there's just not enough variants of firearms and you want to come up with something else, or maybe you don't like the way the reload mechanic works, you'd rather a more stripped down version that just uses loading, or lack thereof, and maybe if you're proficient you don't use loading, whatever. You can expand on that. You are at liberty to do that, and indeed, you should do that. And it's not just mechanics in the sense of, you know, exploration and yada yada yada. You can go right down to the nitty gritty. You can add brand new mechanics to monsters if you like. I know a lot of DMs who have run older editions and other RPGs like to use this. They use things like the bloodied mechanic from 4th edition, which is a really obvious mechanic, right? Every person ever knows multi-stage boss fights, right? We've all played games that have that. The bloodied mechanic allows you to kind of introduce that. Or maybe you don't even want to do that. Maybe you just want to have a genuine multi-stage boss fight. The important thing with fight mechanics is they shouldn't feel like bullshit to your players. They should feel like they make a lot of sense. I had a mechanic recently. I was running a large amount of goblins, and I added a number of mechanics that played into the idea of goblin society being very structured and hierarchical, whatever the correct word is, that's what I said. And commanders could take extra reactions. They had a certain number. I wrote this all down. I wasn't just making it up. It wasn't just, oh, I'm going to decide they get an extra reaction now. It's like, okay, no, they got 3 they can use total. And then the next rank up had like 5 they could use total. And these were special reactions that were like, you can make any goblinoid you can see within 30 feet make a weapon attack immediately. Something like that. And then as you got higher up the chain of command, there were like hobgoblins that would have a little goblin strapped to their back that would hand them a healing potion. This was one of the extra reactions they could do. Suddenly they could get a whole load of health topped off. And the party was like, oh my god, now that they've seen that happen, they're like, this is something they can do. We need to address that. We can't let that happen again. We can't have our damage negated. Let's kill the goblin on its back, then let's kill the hobgoblin. And suddenly, again, they're interacting with the combat in a different way. A lot of DMs do a similar thing by giving pack tactics to creatures that feel like they should have them. Goblins being a good example. Things that operate in squadrons with a somewhat organized way of doing things, or even wild animals that do hunt in packs, like wolves and things. I think wolves do already have pack tactics, but you know what I mean. A lot of DMs will introduce that as a mechanic. It's one that exists there, and you can put it on other creatures. And you can even expand on it a little ways. Or you can strip it down. If it's a bit too much for a particular encounter, but you still want things to have some kind of bonus, you could do something like that. You are at liberty to play with these mechanics, to expand on them, to build on them, come up with your own stuff. Word of advice, though. Let your players know. Let your players know that that's what you're doing. Hey guys, I got a goblin encounter. This particular fight is going to have a bunch of extra mechanics in it. I'm not going to tell you exactly what they are, but you are going to know by the end of the combat. If it's too much, let me know. If it's too strong, too weak, what have you. Or even just talk about it after the fact. Hey guys, a lot of the extra stuff in that goblin encounter, or the reactions they were getting, it's a new mechanic I'm kind of playing around with for these fights where the enemy will have quite a hard military structure. How did we feel about that? Was it too much? Was it too little? Was it telegraphed? Did it feel like you could actually do something about this, or did it just feel like the enemy was getting extra bullshit? Have those discussions, because if you do introduce a mechanic and it sucks, you want to know. Otherwise, you're going to spoil your game, which is the opposite of what you're trying to do when you introduce those new mechanics. However, do so fearlessly. Introduce whatever the hell it is you want for your game. Whatever you feel is going to work. Whatever is necessary. Maybe in your world, helmets need to be a discrete piece of gear that provide their own bonus of some variety. Maybe. Maybe there's not enough reach weapons in your game. Maybe there's a lot more fighting on horseback in your game, and you need some really particular rules about it. Maybe you need rules for how every single class uses horseback. Maybe you've got a game where you are using the honor score variant rule. There's going to be a lot of chivalry, and therefore you need detailed rules regarding factions and how the honor score plays into them. Maybe you need to introduce entire new skills. I've just done this in my campaign. I've introduced the tinkering skill because my world is a sort of proto-industrial one, and it's actually becoming increasingly relevant for players to be able to tinker. And it's linked to intelligence so that there's a little bit more use for that ability score. And it also means that, you know, the very studious wizard who understands technology is going to be doing better with the tinkering score than, say, the cleric who worships a god. Introduce things to your game, new mechanics, where you need them, and do so constantly if you need, because the end result is you're going to get a great campaign that is perfect for what you are trying to do. So that's been this Lessons from the Table. all about those sweet, sweet mechanics. Remember, they are only a framework. They are only a guideline. They are there for you to build upon them. Happy gaming. See you next time.